From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Steinhauer, and I'm a program specialist at the John W. Kluge Center, Library of Congress. Before I begin today's program, please take a moment to check your cell phones and other electronic devices and ensure that they are set to silent. Thank you. I'll also make you aware that this afternoon's program is being filmed for placement on the Kluge Center website and on our iTunes and YouTube channels. I encourage you to visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, K-L-U-G-E, to view other lectures delivered by current and former Kluge scholars, including several on the history of science, map making, and cartography. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress and co-sponsored by the library's Geography and Map Division. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars as well as postdoctoral fellows and PhD candidates to do research in the library's collections. And we also offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, book talks, panel discussions, conversations, many other public events, such as this one. And we administer the Kluge Prize, which we will be awarding in 2015, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the study of the humanity. For more information about the Kluge Center, please visit our website, and I invite you to sign up for our RSS feed, which is right over there, to learn about future programs and opportunities for you to conduct your own research here in the Library of Congress collections. Today's lecture is titled Mapping New World Peoples in Renaissance Europe, and our speaker is Dr. Surekha Davies, now concluding her tenure as Kislak Fellow here at the John W. Kluge Center. The Kislak Fellowship is endowed by the Kislak Fund, which supports scholarly research in the Kislak collection. And the collection is an extraordinary assemblage of 4,000 rare books, maps, documents, paintings, prints, and artifacts that document the history and cultures of the early Americas, as well as early encounters of European explorers and indigenous peoples. Among its treasures is Christopher Columbus's account of his 1492 voyage to the Americas, the first map of the world to identify America as a distinct and separate continent, and carved vessels and vases from the early modern period and earlier, from Aztec and Mixtec cultures. That's just a sampling of the holdings in that collection. The curator of the collection is John Hessler, who is also a former fellow at the Kluge Center, and to him we are grateful for his collaboration on the fellowship and this event, as well as holding the event in this beautifully redesigned geography and map reading room. I'd also like to recognize Ralph Ehrenberg, the chief of the Geography and Map Division. The library's Geography and Map Division holds the largest and most comprehensive cartographic collection in the world. It has more than 5.5 million maps, as well as atlases, reference works, over 500 globes, which I thought was interesting, a multitude of rich resources online, and many, many other treasures. I encourage you to visit their website, loc.gov/rr/geogmap, to learn more. Today's speaker is Dr. Surekha Davies, an assistant professor of European history at Western Connecticut State University. Surekha was educated at the University of Cambridge and gained her doctorate from the Warburg Institute at University of London. A cultural historian, her research interests include cultural encounters, travel writing, the histories of knowledge and science, and cartography. Formerly a curator at the British Library, Map Library, she is a founding editor of the new book series Maps, Spaces, Cultures, to be published by Brill. Her first book, Of Monsters and Men, Maps, Ethnography, and the Americas in Renaissance Europe, is under contract with Cambridge University Press, and is the subject of her research and writing here at the Kluge Center as a Kislak Fellow. Her articles have appeared in such journals as the Historical Journal, History and Anthropology, and Renaissance Studies. She edited a special double issue of the Journal of Early Modern History, which came out earlier this year, and she organized an international conference called The Global Dimensions of European Knowledge 1450 to 1700. She's a very active scholar with a very impressive resume. These are just some of her many accomplishments. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Surekha Davies.
Thank you, Jason. And let me start by thanking the J. Kislak Foundation, the Library of Congress, and the Kluge Center. The people and the materials here at the Library of Congress make this, an extremely productive and wonderful place in which to work. So let's begin. In 1594, the English mathematician Thomas Blundeville published an essay, and in it he described a map by the Flemish mapmaker Petrus Plancius, a map on which cannibals and giants appear in the Americas. Blundeville says, "They are mere lies that are told of the pygmies, that they should be but a foot and a half high, and likewise which hath been spoken of the people that should have their heads, noses, mouths, and eyes in their breasts, or of those that are headed like a dog, or those that have but one eye, and that in their forehead, or of those that have but one foot, and that so great that it covereth their whole body. All these are mere lies, invented by vain men to bring fools into admiration, for monsters are as well born in Europe as they are in other parts of the world." Blundeville's list of unlikely beings echoes the monstrous peoples in classical and medieval traditions for distant places. You can see an example of that in a detail of a map from the late 13th century at the top left there. For Blundeville, if monstrous beings do exist in distant places, they are not a nation of people with a monstrous trait, but rather monstrous individuals of the sort encountered in Europe. You can see an example at the bottom right there. The explanations traditionally offered for domestic monsters, that is, monsters as errors, as nature's jokes, or as divine portents, were also sufficient, in Blundeville's eyes, to explain instances of monsters abroad. Blundeville's reservations point to the uneasy boundary between monsters at home in Europe and monsters far away. And yet it is precisely this ontological slippage, that from one-off monsters to monsters in distant places, that the visual language of Renaissance maps facilitated. Map viewers examined the details on maps carefully, reading the distinctive characteristics of individual figures as a summary of what people in that region had in common and of how they differed from other peoples. And this is the subject of the rest of my book. In this talk, I shall focus on the wondrous ethnography of one region, Guiana. Problems of credibility were acute for Renaissance travelers and for the editors, printers, cosmographers, and mapmakers who repackaged travel information in new formats. These cultural arbiters, as Christine Johnson has termed them, deployed distinctive rhetorical strategies to endow their works with authority. They needed to convince their readers of their powers of analysis and synthesis. We must therefore beware of assuming that content that appears to 21st century eyes to be inaccurate or frivolous was viewed in these ways. In today's paper, by analyzing European ethnographic writing and mapping of Guiana, I show how simplistic binaries of real and imaginary, based on modern categories, do not illuminate earlier mentalities. Renaissance readers did not have the same emotional and intellectual responses to diagrams of a distant monster as might a 21st century observer. Most of the existing literature on Renaissance ideas about distant monsters is of the coffee table book variety, and assume that there is little we can learn by looking at images of people on maps because they are just decorations that reveal ignorance and nothing more. Before people knew what there was in faraway places, they supposedly put monsters there. Once they had more information, the monsters were apparently removed from maps. They were, in other words, mere decoration. One of the arguments of my book as a whole is that this popular view of maps in the age of exploration is wrong. What these claims fail to take into account is decades of rigorous scholarship on the Middle Ages and on the early modern period, say between 800 and 1800, in the history of science, in art history, cultural history, and literary studies. Scholars in these disciplines have developed rigorous analytical methods and tools that we can use to analyze monstrous peoples on Renaissance maps. My talk today is a brief illumination of some of the ways that this can be done. And it's divided now into three parts. First, I'll talk about better approaches for thinking about illustrations on maps. Second, I'll analyze the wondrous ethnography of late 16th century Guiana in the travel account of Sir Walter Raleigh, the explorer and corsair. Finally, I shall analyze the ways in which mapmakers process two elements of Guiana's ethnography, a headless tribe and a tribe of Amazons. On to the first part, then. A common conception in the popular imagination is decoration, and the term is often used to mean that which has no purpose other than to please the eye. This pejorative use of the word decoration blinds us to the insights that the analytical study of visual artifacts offers. Art historians, by contrast, have shown us that artifacts do not have a single practical function, with every other element being decorative, or worse, imaginary. Anyone who has been on the DC Metro knows that it is uniformly grey and not all colours of the rainbow, as the DC Metro map would have you believe. And if you've caught the red line on a Sunday, you know that trains can be as rare as unicorns. The historical circumstances in which an image, or more precisely a diagram, is made shape its contents and form. By analysing them, we can arrive at insights into the cultures that produce them. There's nothing mere about decoration. Meaning inheres in the aesthetic and other details of artifacts. And there is a reason why academics don't give conference papers in their pajamas. Appearances matter. Maps, then, are best thought of as diagrams rather than decorations. My second point on method concerns monsters. As the medievalist Asa Mittman recently put it, monsters do a great deal of cultural work, but they do not do it nicely. Monsters signal to us the fracture points of a culture's categories. That which is neither this nor that is by definition a monster. The one constant to the definition across space and time is that a monster doesn't fit existing categories of physique, of behavior, or perhaps of ethics. We know monsters from the way they conjure up a sense of ruptured ontological categories, the dashing of tidy expectations. If a monster is that which creates an effect, all monsters are, by definition, real. They are subjective, contested constructs defined with respect to the self. As Catherine Park and Lorraine Daston have shown, in the apprehension of monsters and wonders, emotion and cognition are intricately intertwined. The notion that monsters are, by definition, imaginary is a very recent, perhaps 20th century notion. And its appearance tells us something about the myth of modernity, and it's linked to various myths about the objectivity of modern science. And we can talk about this in the questions if you like. My argument, by contrast, is that writing about monsters in distant places elucidates part of a longue durée history, that of human attempts to map the historical geography of intelligent life and the order of living beings. Indeed, today, the languages of gender, class, caste, race, and religion frequently monstrify and dehumanize groups. And if you are reminded of Ananya Vajpayee's wonderful talk at the library yesterday, you are on the right track. Just as new fossil evidence regularly shapes current notions of human and animal evolution and the classification of species, Renaissance Europeans' encounters with new peoples and animals and their attempts to shape them, to understand them, reshape the concept of the human, the genealogy of humanity, and the boundaries between human, monster, and animal. In order to understand the cultures and contexts in which these notions were important, one must historicize Renaissance ideas about human diversity that appear to our eyes to be false. My final subsection on method is some background on how illustrated maps were viewed and used in the Renaissance. Several features made 16th century maps different from other ethnographic genres of their era. They allowed one to gaze at once at the peoples of different places on one surface. Maps also showed you where people who looked and behaved differently lived in relation to one another. World maps and other small-scale maps covering large areas looked very different in the 16th century to the way they looked in the Middle Ages. Let me show you now again the Salter world map, which is as small as the palm of my hand. You can see the rim of the world has monstrous peoples in the south and the east. So at the very top of the map is east, and sorry, at the south you can see monstrous peoples. Whereas in the 16th century, we see a new spatial turn where large-scale, the introduction of a latitudinal and longitudinal coordinate system from the Greco-Roman mathematician Ptolemy of the 2nd century AD into these large world maps in the 16th century meant world maps looked rather more like this, mimicking the view from above all of the Earth rather than the view of space from a standing position in Jerusalem. In the 16th century, mapmakers began to claim explicitly authority for their own summations of the globe, by reference to both eyewitness experience of travel and their own textual exegesis. They did this despite the fact that they did not have first-hand knowledge of the whole world, and quite often had not travelled at all. What is more, while late medieval maps had foregrounded trade and commodities, early modern world maps and maps of the Americas concentrated on peoples. What we see in the era of oceanic expansion is a distinct shift in how mapmakers chose to use the space of a map. For early modern European readers familiar with ancient Greek humoral theory or with its vernacular iterations, human customs, temperaments and physiques were understood to be affected by geography. Extremes in latitude were thought to generate physical deformities, for example. If this sounds silly, you might bear in mind that today's astrobiologists study extremophiles, plants and animals that live in the harshest of climates. And through this, they think about what life on other planets might be like. The placement then of ethnographic images within a gridded spatial system was tantamount to providing viewers with a shortcut for extrapolating a people's levels of civility. The relationship between maps and ethnography became more precisely intertwined. Let's look at some details now. Many early modern illustrated atlases and maps were very large, 2.5 meters across for a map or 60 centimeters high for an atlas. And here is a detail from a sheet of a manuscript atlas showing Brazil. This kind of artifact was very bulky and rarely intended for direction finding or navigation. Rather, they were visual grammars summarizing key information about the world's peoples, natural history and geography. Richly decorated manuscript maps produced in Spain, Portugal and Normandy were intended for royalty, for nobility and scholars. They sometimes functioned as diplomatic gifts. Printed maps and atlases from the German lands and the Low Countries were produced in larger numbers for the open market. Wall maps like this one were bought and displayed by wealthy townsfolk, merchants and scholars. By the 1660s, for example, each office of the Dutch East India and West India companies might have had 10 to 60 wall maps and landscape paintings on display. Maps were useful for teaching geography, history and scripture and functioned as political and military aids. The English mathematician John Dee observed that maps were used by, and I quote, some to beautify their halls, parlours, chambers, galleries, studies or libraries with, others some for things past, as battles fought. Some other presently to view the large dominion of the Turk, the wide empire of the Muscovite, and the little morsel of ground where Christendom by profession is certainly known. Some for one purpose and some for another, liketh, loveth, getteth and useth maps, charts and geographical globes. Dee observed that it would take an entire book to list the uses of maps. Unfortunately for me, he didn't bother writing one. In short, the descriptive captions and illustrations of these maps were integral to their use. In the context of Renaissance voyages of exploration, they offered readers a handy guide to the latest discoveries. And here are some examples of details from the iconography of the Americas. At the top left, you see giants of Patagonia. At the top right, you see man-eating practices in Brazil. The bottom right are a headless person and an Amazon from Guiana, who we will meet in more detail in a minute. And at the bottom right is an image of one of the cities of the Inca Empire. Maps constructed and disseminated iconic stereotypes. Indeed, their very reductive powers was one of the reasons they were consulted. They invited comparisons between people, thus stimulating comparative ethnology. Maps made the link between human diversity and geography explicit and visual. Renaissance maps of the Americas contained prominent iconic images and descriptions of peoples, ranging from noble warriors in Virginia to giants in Patagonia. They regularly trumpeted their works with claims like most accurate and most recent. These images presented mapmakers as synthesizers with the necessary perspective to evaluate travelers' observations, incorporate them into existing knowledge, and disseminate the result in a useful format. Now on to the second part of my talk, the wondrous ethnography in Walter Raleigh's discovery of Guiana. Of all the New World peoples on early modern maps, perhaps none had as mixed a reception as the inhabitants of Guiana. In 1596, the travel narrative of the English courtier and corsair Sir Walter Raleigh, entitled The Discovery of the Large, Rich and Beautiful Empire of Guiana, appeared in print. For the next 2 decades, headless men and, to a lesser extent, Amazons inspired illustrations and captions on maps and in translations of Raleigh's discovery. Their makers, like Raleigh, needed to tack deftly between general expectations of monsters in distant regions and the widespread awareness that travellers' testimony was problematic to verify and could even be fabricated. Since Raleigh, mapmakers and printers wished to sustain their credibility, why did they include these beings? What work did monstrous peoples perform for these cultural arbiters? Selling colonial ventures in Renaissance England was far from simple. While the sun never set on the Spanish Empire, the English crown, court and investors remained largely unconvinced that imperial activities were a good investment. When Raleigh set out in search of the gold-rich empire of Guiana in 1595, he hoped to facilitate his return to court and the favour of his queen Elizabeth I. The courtier Sir Robert Cecil sponsored the expedition, which the court had refused to support. I want to stress here that Raleigh's claim that Guiana contained rich veins of gold and the land of El Dorado were perfectly reasonable ones. According to prevailing traditions of climatic theory, since gold had been found in the hot equatorial regions of West Africa, it could equally be expected to be abundant in Guiana. Raleigh's El Dorado was a city made of gold, ruled by one El Dorado, or the Golden One, who, anointed annually with gold dust, paddled to the center of an enormous lake where he would make votive offerings of gold figures. And figures with this iconography of a man sailing to the middle of a lake have indeed been recovered from lakes in Colombia in recent years. European understandings of El Dorado were a bricolage of indigenous beliefs and gold-working practices for which abundant evidence survives. If you have visited the Dumbarton Oaks Museum in Georgetown, you will have seen tangible evidence of indigenous Amerindian gold-working. Modern anthropologists, notably the late Neil Whitehead, have interrogated Raleigh's text alongside ethnohistorical, archaeological, and oral historical sources and found corroborating evidence for the key wonders of Raleigh's text: gold, Amazons, and headless people. So indigenous practices, local folklore, and real historical interactions are visible through the rhetorical forest of Raleigh's prose. Raleigh could well have gleaned the idea of a headless tribe from his local interlocutors, for example. But why include descriptions of headless folk in a text written to bolster your credibility? And here are a few Renaissance images of headless folk, and actually a medieval one at the top. In the middle of the detail from the 13th century Psalter map, you can see some folks with their heads in their chest. The bottom left is a late 16th century Dutch map, and the detail from Guiana. And at the bottom right is a late 16th century image of a monstrous birth in Europe, a single individual whose head was not where it usually is, seen from front and back. Raleigh returned from Guiana with little gold. His detractors claimed he had never even left England. Raleigh circulated a manuscript report in an effort to raise funds for a second trip and to prove that he had indeed made the first one. He sent a copy to Sir Robert Cecil, his chief backer, and this survives in Lambeth Palace Library in London. Cecil annotated the manuscript, returning it to Raleigh, who revised his text accordingly for publication. Cecil crossed out certain references to spleen stones, to the bacchanalian distractions of Guiana for drunkards, womanizers and tobacco smokers, and to a mysterious beast called Jawari. By contrast, headless beings called Iwaipanoma and fierce women called Amazons remained and are in the printed editions of Raleigh's discovery. These peoples conjured up a memorable, distinct land, not one resembling any the Spaniards had claimed. This land was therefore available for the English, a land that Shakespeare could expect his audience to bring to mind when he had Othello boast to Desdemona about his adventures in lands with men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. I want to move now to how Raleigh set up the presence in Guiana of a people called Iwaipanoma. And he says, "They were a nation of people whose heads appear not above their shoulders, which, though it may be thought a mere fable, yet for my own part I am resolved it is true, because every child in the provinces of Aramaya and Kanuri affirmed the same." Raleigh's information comes from indigenous informants. This made it potentially less credible to his audience on two fronts. Not only did his readers not have the precise identities of these witnesses, but they were not English. As such, they did not share his readers' modes of civility, religion, or sociocultural credentials, what Andrea Frisch has termed a witness's ethical status. Nevertheless, Raleigh goes to great lengths to bolster each witness's credibility. The consistency of the children's statements, "every child affirmed the same," elevated the whole community of child witnesses. Raleigh noted that he had brought with him to England one of these very children, the son of Topiawari, the king of Aramaya. Topiawari's son's noble birth thus potentially enhanced his credibility. Furthermore, Raleigh introduces here the possibility of his English readers questioning a witness. This is a strategy he also used to bolster another witness of the headless people, a reliable Spaniard, known to two Flemish merchants in London. Raleigh then observes that the Book of John Mandeville, a fictitious 14th century travel account that wove together elements from earlier narratives by actual travellers, also contained headless people. Raleigh asserted that recent voyages to the East Indies found Mandeville's relations true of such things that were hitherto held incredible. While it is difficult to assess the veracity of individual authors and travellers, Raleigh was, I quote, "resolved that so many people did not all combine or forethink to make the report." So he's presenting here a lot of independent witnesses who are saying the same thing. All of Raleigh's rhetorical efforts were aimed at bolstering what Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park have called the extrinsic credibility of a phenomenon, the nature of the witness and the circumstances of the witnessing. What Raleigh does not do is engage with whether headless beings were intrinsically credible. For the early modern reader, it was theoretically possible that distant regions with different climates might have distinct, even monstrous peoples. I want to move now to the final part of my talk, to headless beings on maps. Mapmakers produced the earliest known illustrations of Guiana's Iwaipanoma and Amazons. Their challenge was relaying information that viewers would accept as reliable, at the same time illuminating the most distinct, memorable, and unprecedented information about Guiana. In this way, mapmakers could demonstrate their access to new information and enable their viewers to distinguish Guiana from other places. The map's commentaries, iconography, and formal elements of style and design reveal the multiple strategies through which their makers sought to imbue their works with authority. While Raleigh's truth-telling strategies involved multiple corroborating witnesses, mapmakers deployed rather different strategies in order to make convincing claims in a predominantly visual format. And here is an example. Around 1600, Guiana's ethnography charged the imaginations of the influential Dutch mapmaker Jodocus Hondius the Elder and his close associates. Hondius had resided in London between 1584 and 1593. He may well have known Blundeville's printed description of Plancius's map that I quoted at the beginning, which was sceptical of entire tribes of monstrous peoples. Both Hondius and Blundeville moved in the same mathematical circles as Raleigh. Nevertheless, Hondius chose the Iwaipanoma to emblematize Guiana. The potential benefits for him evidently outweighed the risks of overplaying the monster card. The layout of Hondius' single-sheet map of Guiana, his staging, if you will, of Guiana's peoples, is in many ways highly original. Single-sheet maps of other New World regions had not contained this much writing before. The interplay between various elements, title, ethnographic caption, etc., build a powerful set of corroborations for the wondrous elements. The map makes frequent references to its derivation from the testimony of individuals on Raleigh's expeditions. For example, the title announces that this is a map of the wondrous land full of gold called Guiana, recently visited by Sir Walter Raleigh in the years 1594, 95 and 96. The coasts of this map have been drawn diligently by a certain ship's mate, who has sailed along them and visited them in the years noted previously. The interior provinces have been extracted with great difficulty from both booklets that have been published by and on order of the aforementioned Raleigh. While Hondius has not drawn Guiana or its peoples from life, he's arguably done something just as useful. He has synthesized the experience of several witnesses. Not only did mapmakers embed the authority of eyewitnesses into their maps, but they also constructed an authority of the workshop. Two large figures appear in the center, identified as a man from the province of Iwaipanoma without a head and a figure of an Amazon woman. In the map's description of headless men, there is no mention of Raleigh's indigenous informants, who have effectively been rendered invisible, or perhaps inaudible. The caption reads, Iwaipanoma, in this province, as Raleigh writes, the people have no heads and are very strong and cruel. Stephen Shapin noticed a similar phenomenon in English experimental philosophy of the 17th century. Experiments sometimes dependent on the activities of invisible technicians, as Shapin puts it. And yet they were rarely credited in subsequent reports. Hondius' excision of indigenous informants, presumably for brevity and credibility, is a variant of this phenomenon. In the caption about Amazons, the indigenous peoples are similarly missing, even though they appear in Raleigh's text. Hondius surely wished for his readers to believe that he had reliable information and chose his witness, a European nobleman, accordingly. Readers would no doubt have assumed that Raleigh had described what he had seen. He had, after all, visited Guiana. Some readers were unconvinced of the existence of Iwaipanoma, but not because they thought they were physically impossible. A roughly contemporary annotation in Dutch below the Iwaipanoma on the British Library's exemplar reads, "This, I think, is fabricated because," wait for it, "no Dutchman ever saw it." A similar skepticism is evident in the annotation to the right of the Amazon, thus Raleigh. While this is only one reader's view, it does bear out the continuing importance of the ethical status of a witness in relation to the judges of his or her testimony. The closer the ethical status of witness and judge, the more likely it was that the testimony would be believed. This 17th century reader was perhaps aware that subsequent Dutch voyages had not corroborated Raleigh's claims, and it was on that basis, rather than on any notion of Iwaipanoma being impossible in nature, that prompted his skepticism. The headless folk of Guiana had a brief, problematic afterlife on 4 Dutch wall maps of the Americas and of the world. Here, text and images about Iwaipanoma appear alongside other peoples, facilitating comparative study. These representations allow us to trace the rise of doubt about these beings among Hondius' circle and their gradual loss of faith in Raleigh as a source. Raleigh's 1598 map of the Americas illustrates the headless men as part of a frieze of New World peoples. This innovation enabled Hondius to contextualize the Iwaipanoma and his sources in relation to peoples with whom the reader might already be familiar. Now, in order for mapmakers to add imagery about Guiana's people to the actual body of South America on a map, they needed to deal with the problem of space. Brazil's cannibals, which you see on the left, and Peru's cities on the right, were already jostling for space on the main body of the map. By designing a frieze, by contrast, Hondius drew attention to human diversity and provided more room in which to articulate it. While this move of ethnographic information out of the main landmasses has traditionally been termed a banishment to the margins, such margins, borders, and standout illustrative sections in fact give this material greater emphasis. It is to these areas that the viewer's eyes turn. From left to right, the figures present a decreasing degree of difference and monstrosity. The physical aberration of the headless man is visible to all. This is a headless man in the province of Guiana, called Iwaipanoma, as Walter Raleigh testifies, goes the caption. Again, it is Raleigh himself who is implicitly credited as a witness, rather than his indigenous observers. The behavioral aberration of the next two figures, the cannibals Quaniambek and Tarizikas, is not visible, but would have been known to those who are familiar with 16th century travel writing about the Tupi people of Brazil. The next two figures, the inhabitants of Florida, were less other and monstrous again. By illustrating distinct peoples in different regions, Hondius indicated that he had indeed consulted a multitude of sources, including the newest ones. The rhetorical arrangement of the frieze reduces the ethnographic difference and the skepticism that might follow from too much difference between the European and the Iwaipanoma. Reading from right to left, the steps between civilized humanity and monstrosity are rendered more credible. Other details, the shadows cast by the figures, for example, are elements of a visual rhetoric of eyewitnessing. Subsequent appearances of the Iwaipanoma show mapmakers experimenting with their anatomy. On Cornelis Claas's 1602 map of America, which Hondius probably engraved, the Guianan still lacks a neck. See him at the extreme right there. But now has a head that is distinct from his chest, as opposed to a face below his shoulders. Other borrowed figures are unchanged. So at the top, the frieze shows peoples from the north of America, and the bottom are the South American peoples. I'm going to join them together here. The top detail is from the 1598 map. The bottom two details are from the 1602 map, and you can see that the 1602 map has copied all the figures faithfully except for the headless man, who is now sprouted a head. The accompanying caption for the Iwaipanoma is also equivocal, and we learn that he is a man who is said to be without a head in the province of Guiana. Not only have we lost a statement of authorial testimony relating to Raleigh, but the illustration leads us to doubt the man's headlessness. When Hondius published an illustrated world map in 1608, he chose not to include images of headless peoples or Amazons at all. The reasons do not emerge from the archive, but two factors may have contributed to this decision. First, by this point, Raleigh's own fortunes had nosedived. After the death of the Queen in 1603, he was imprisoned in the Tower and tried for treason, suspected of involvement in a plot against King James I. Secondly, through his English contacts, Hondius might well have been aware that Raleigh's words on Guiana were now worth little, and that Dutch voyages had failed to corroborate the Iwaipanoma. Finally, Hondius was probably aware that, secondly, the Dutch voyages had failed to corroborate his report. A caption on this map notes that Raleigh also affirms from the report of the indigenous inhabitants that in some places the people are vigorous but with an unheard of appearance, that is, some are without heads or even have dogs' heads, brackets, which, however, I think are far-fetched. This shift of witness is crucial. Hondius had previously quoted a passage about Amazons on a map and referred to Raleigh's writing about Iwaipanoma, while, in both cases, omitting mention of indigenous witnesses. Now, as he expresses doubts that these beings exist, rather than sticking with Raleigh, the source he had used before, Hondius deploys the hearsay of unnamed, indigenous, ethically uncertain witnesses, thereby justifying his own doubt. Some conclusions, then. Raleigh's inclusion of distinctive, memorable ethnography for Guiana created a geographical region that was both previously undiscovered and capable of being the location of El Dorado. The headless man made Guiana distinctive from other New World regions, those emblematized by these motifs, for example. Crucially, the headless man suggested that Raleigh had not merely read accounts of other regions, but had actually been somewhere new. Underlying mapmakers' iconographic decisions was a desire to show human difference across geographical space. Thus we see across the Americas the selection of iconography to have been partly shaped by which motifs, from the relative travel accounts had not already been used elsewhere. Once Brazil was associated with cannibals, for example, other regions with other climates had to be represented differently in order to bolster the mapmakers' claims to authenticity. When map illustrators reduced the diverse inhabitants of particular regions, such as Guiana or Virginia, to distinct motifs, they contributed to the emergence of a typology of distant peoples. Mapmakers paid careful attention to the travellers' accounts for particular areas when they derived their images. By selecting those that had not been used before, those that were new to each region, they could claim for themselves the authority of their eyewitness sources. Paradoxically, this meant that cultural stereotypes contributed to a sense of diversity across America's populations. The headless beings were intrinsically credible. It was the quality and quantity of the witnesses that was under scrutiny. The Iwaipanoma illuminate two coexisting epistemologies, that of the epistemic eyewitness and that of the ethical eyewitness, whose authority rests in the relationship between and the shared values of eyewitness and audience. Raleigh wanted readers to believe that he really had been to Guiana. Simultaneously, he offered eyewitnesses for something he himself had not seen, just as mapmakers did. Mapmakers latched onto these most distinctive elements and trumpeted the knight's authority, as far as they wished to portray this as unproblematic knowledge. The ethnographic parade format, a fleeting experiment, allowed them to contextualize elements at the edge of credibility. Hondius, by choosing just the headless folk and not the Amazons for his larger maps, brought the iconography of Guiana's peoples in line with cartographic practices for other regions. One place, one people. The way in which Hondius and his associates gradually phased out the Iwaipanoma reveals the continuing importance for ethnographic knowledge of ethical witnessing, where authority is established through social and moral values. In an era in which, as Anne Blair put it, there was too much to know, there was a decentering of the eyewitness by cultural arbiters who, at the same time, sought to bask in their glow. What the implicit and spoken anxieties of various commentators shows is that mapmakers, the authors of their sources, and the users of their maps explored multiple avenues for analyzing information about phenomena at the boundaries of credibility, about places where things were different were necessarily plausible. Finally, looking at illustrated maps offers historians new locales, actors, and sources with which to think about Renaissance and early modern science as a visual pursuit. One should not simply stick with the usual settings and actors, like the Royal Society in London, for example, and just add images and stir. But rather, one should think about what media, contexts, and practitioners are likely to have made knowledge visually. Renaissance maps were a medium of visual communication with a distinctive epistemological power. The coordinate system, together with ancient theories of how geography and climate affected human bodies, temperaments, and behaviors, meant that the placement of people in a particular place on a map had ontological implications. Mapmakers, through their illustrations and textual commentaries, made arguments about human societies, cultures, and bodies across the globe. By doing so, they engaged with the challenges of evaluating observations made in distant places by multiple agents and synthesizing them in such a way that their own audiences would consider them to be both reliable and suitably wondrous. Thank you. Well, we have a certain amount of time for questions, which I welcome. Yes?
How widespread was this debate around the reality or otherwise, or the veracity or otherwise of the travel writing and the maps of Britain? Was this just a few men in the Royal Society bantering around, or would this have been broader and more encompassing in Europe?
There was an ancient fable that people who were very old or people who had traveled very far could lie with impunity because no one could test what they said. So it was. Well, I mean, folk tale is a wrong word, but it was a commonly held issue, and of course something that the popular books from the present often say is, oh, everybody was very gullible in the past. You know, they're kind of these old, it's an old adage, oh yeah, well, that lot. Like we can test what they say. So you do see discussions of credibility all over the place, and sometimes travelers in their prefaces to their books will talk very explicitly about why they're credible. So it was something they needed to work on. Kirsten.
Can I just ask about the ships in the maps and the way that the seas were kind of people also as well as the land? I was wondering, were the ships trade routes, or was that a way of inscribing the explorers into the maps, or what?
The ships do a number of things, and there's a recent book by someone called Richard Unger that is actually called Ships in Maps and talks through some of this. One of the things that ships do in this context is that they remind the viewer that people were actually going places. So it's a rhetorical device for authenticity. Sometimes on some maps they do track routes. So that's another thing they do. There are cases where you can see the precise flags of ships, so you can celebrate which nations were going where, especially if they are the nations who are sponsoring your mapping. Peter.
You mentioned in the beginning that images as decoration on maps are wrong, but at the end you bring back the idea that there had to be, every new distant area had to be identified with an image, which is kind of, it's not really decoration, but like icons. So it's kind of the headless people are the mascots for Guana.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering what
Great.
you think about it.
When I say that the word decoration is misleading, the word decoration in the modern sense is misleading because there's a word that comes before it, which is meaningless. It's like implicit in it is that it's only about beauty. But if you have a very distinct imagery for different places that has been taken out of travel writing, that the viewers of your map would actually have in front of you as they consulted your map, if the details didn't matter, they wouldn't need to go and read the books and choose things. They wouldn't need to write captions about how carefully they've done the work. So it's different from a wallpaper motif. It's more like a diagram, which is not to say that everything is perfect and right, but the way these things functioned was as scientific diagrams, which is not to say that they weren't pleasing to the eye, but the idea that decoration has nothing else there but a wallpaper stamp, so that's what I would disagree with. John?
I'm going to take just issue with the categorization of the word map maker.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we're looking at these images on Renaissance maps of a small sample of Renaissance maps, meaning there are thousands and thousands of Renaissance maps that have absolutely no images whatsoever of these people. And there's an implied epistemological split here between these maps that are produced in order to show your certain icons, as you are calling them, and the actual map itself, which is really a scientific instrument. And could you talk a little bit about that parallel development? Because the maps develop much quicker as technological instruments, the accuracy of the coastlines, and yet the images stay for a very, very long period of time, almost as if they're just repeated as rote images, icons, as you said, almost as if, to a certain extent, they're secondary.
Okay, thank you. So let's start with how many maps might look like this. So at the start of this research project, I got special permission to go 8 floors down into the bowels of 8 floors underground into the British Library's basement and pulled out all the trays. So what I said to them is, you could either deliver to me the 2,500 maps that fall into my time frame, and I will send most of them back saying no pictures, no pictures, no pictures, no pictures, or you can let me into the basement. So the bedrock of the research starts with the 8 floors down in the basement pulling out trays, and then supplementing that with other printed manuscript maps from libraries like the Newbury, the Huntington, BNF in Paris, etc., kind of Munich, and I've been to the Library of Congress before, etc., etc. So when I started, I didn't know what proportion was going to have images. But what I focused on was world maps and maps of large continents. So what I'm not looking at in this book is maps of one village, manuscript maps of one village that got sent to one person, like in the Relaciones Geográficas, for example. So of all of these, examples that I looked, just to see how many are going to be and build the database, out of about 3,000 maps, 1 in 10 has illustrations of people that goes beyond a completely plain stick figure. So in the period, say, 1500 to 1620, 1 in 10 has some kind of distinctive imagery of peoples. But, is it all, are they all just the same? Well, what I do by actually analyzing each one in detail is what I've shown is how much variation there is, how many different ways there were of representing, for example, cannibalism on maps. And I may have, okay, you might want to shut your eyes. I have some extras saved up somewhere. Where are they? Okay. There are many different images of cannibalism. And by actually taking the trouble to look at each element, on the right, for example, the wonderful, extraordinary, my favorite thing on earth, Waldseemüller map in the Early Americas Gallery of the Kislak collection, you see, for example, limbs hanging from a tree and a spit roasting, and there is writing that shows that viewers of these maps in the 16th century were actually looking at these details and thinking about them. For example, on the left is an image from a 16th century travel account that doesn't show you spit roasting. And Jean de Lery, a traveler to Brazil, talks about maps that show you Brazil with man-eating imagery. And he says something like, oh, and on those maps of the Americas, they show you limbs being hung from trees and limbs being roasted on spits and people chopping figures on great iron benches. And he complains, saying these map makers don't know what they're talking about, because what they actually do in Brazil is they cook on a barbecue. And he then describes this all-American cooking method. And so what is this fight about? Well, the map makers took the material from writing about the Caribbean islands. But on a map, even a map that's 4 times the size of this sheet, the Caribbean islands aren't really very big. And so in 1516, when the Waldseemüller map was put together, the images were placed in the nearest bit of land that had any kind of space, which is Brazil. But for a later viewer looking at them, they read this icon as meaning this is the thing that everybody in this place shared. And they were looking right down to the detail of, it's supposed to be limbs, on barbecues. It's not supposed to be spit roast. It's not supposed to be whole bodies. So when I drill down into those details and look at the travel accounts and see that you actually have captions that are on, say, the Waldseemüller map that come from the writings of Columbus and Vespucci, talking about limbs hanging from above, the map makers have gone to this great amount of precision. So, sorry, to cut the long story short, in the book, by actually analyzing one after the other, and the dissertation, even more of them, you see them. It's surprising that they should bother making changes. I think each time they're going back and chewing over the material. And for something like the Patagonian giants, whoa, where am I going? The earliest images of Patagonian giants are all on maps. So they had to start with quite short descriptions in text that say things like, I saw some people who were very tall, these giants did a dance, they painted their faces. But when you then put giants on the map, they have to kind of fill in some of those blanks and extrapolate them. It's the kind of thing that scientists always do. You don't have complete information, so you try to think about the new information in the light of your old information, and sometimes there will be a paradigm shift. And sorry, just the last thing about maps as a scientific instrument. A large world map can't be used to do anything. So the accuracy of the coastlines, well, you're still not going to do anything with it. So for a map that was meant to be used in a study, say, it didn't actually serve a direct practical purpose beyond the rhetorical. I mean, clearly there were lots of maps that were used for very practical purposes, whether it's the politics of empire or planning voyages, trying to figure out whether there was a northwest passage to China over North America. Some of those kinds of maps wouldn't survive. You've only got to be a tourist for a week with a map, and by the end of it, it's fallen apart. So the survival of maps is such that it's the maps that were used for contemplation that were more likely to survive anyway. Yeah.
Just could you offer a word on the economics of it? I mean, how many maps were sold? I was thinking of, in modern times, they have a map of Russia with a bare-chested leader on it. You say these are the types that you find.
Mm-hmm.
So this was mostly a money-making proposition as printing, changed.
A money-making proposition as opposed to?
Just scientific.
Well, I would say that science is money today. Nobody, the scientist has to eat. Somebody's got to pay for their training. They don't separate into that's for science and that's for money.
More popular than another? I mean, that's what I was thinking. That's your substance of saying striving to market.
Yeah, something interesting happens in the late 16th century, which is you have access to a lot more high-quality engravings in books with lots of illustrations. And suddenly map makers are competing to sell their wares alongside things like the debris collection of voyages. So they start experimenting with actually taking images from some of these more popular sources. And one of the ways in which the modes of representation changes is as they respond to things like costume books, like illustrated maps. And if you were making a printed map, they were extremely expensive to make, and you did indeed need to sell them. So on one level, they certainly needed to be able to sell the things to keep in business. But it was the rhetoric of knowledge that they were using to sell printed maps in the 16th century. That's what they wanted you to think about. They wanted the rich burghers in the cities to celebrate their investments, to also demonstrate how smart they were.
Take one more question and we'll have to.
Just one of them.
Similar theme to Kirsten's question, but it wasn't the ships that caught my eye, it was the dog between the Headless Man and the Amazon. Finding the dog is surprisingly not grotesque. And then on the larger map, the other animals, so there was this giant rat, and I think I saw a jaguar perhaps, but they also seemed quite, for my modern eye, they seemed quite usual.
There's a deer.
And I was wondering, I was thinking about notions of tropicality and how often the plants and the animals, the flora and fauna can also act in a grotesque manner. They seem to be strangely absent. I was wondering if that's curious that it's only focusing on the weirdness of the people.
Yes, indeed. There's what you can't see here is there's a deer here on the extreme right, and of course the dog. These extremely mundane animals, which I think help to ground everything else. And there's a ground line where the beings sit. It all contributes to a sense of naturalness, even though, as you say, they weren't exotic and wild and crazy animals. I think it's part of kind of diluting the increasing credibility by diluting the number of things that are difficult.
Right.
It's not 6 different difficult things before breakfast.
On the 1516 Carter Marina, next to that, right next to that.
Yeah, there's an opossum.
Of the roasted spit sits the first image
Of an opossum, yeah.
First New World.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a few. Yeah, I mean, the opossum is one, but it's surprising how few New World animals get this kind of treatment. There's another mythical animal called a high, probably a sloth, that makes a few appearances, but you might expect more animals and more commodities.
The great 1507 map by Watson River was just one animal, just one parrot sitting in Brazil. The only animal on the whole.
Is it a quick question, Don? So we got
Yeah, quick question. I'm just wondering, as you were 8 floors down in the British Library and you were pulling out all those trays, all those maps, were you able to pinpoint the location of El Dorado?
I can't possibly tell you where.
I think on that secret we could leave it there. So allow me to thank. And once again, I just want to also thank the Geography and Map Division and John for allowing us to use the space. We are back at it again tomorrow at noon, where our Jameson Fellow from this past year, Kevin Kim, will return to give a lecture on Cold War America, and particularly Henry Wallace and Herbert Hoover's role in Cold War America. So that'll be in LJ 119 in the Jefferson Building, and please do sign up for our list if you're not already on it to receive notification about such events. So thanks very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.